Ladies and gentlemen, hello, you're watching TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Welcome aboard the Eastern Express. When Moscow says it's uniting the nation, it often means it's dividing it. Russia's new nationality policy elevates ethnic Russians as the state-forming nation and sidelines everyone else. But in a country where 1 in 4 citizens isn't Russian, this strategy could light the fuse on something the Kremlin fears most: fragmentation. On this episode, we dig into why Russia's push for ethnic dominance may be the start of its own unraveling. Because in Putin's Russia, the question of identity is more than just who you are. It's about who you're allowed to be. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Russia's latest draft of its nationality strategy, set to guide policy through 2036, marks a significant shift in focus. For the first time, it places ethnic Russians at the center of national identity, while emphasizing the need to counter perceived foreign threats. Prepared by the Federal Agency for Nationality Affairs, the document highlights the role of ethnic Russians as the state-forming nation, a notable departure from previous strategies that concentrated more on protecting minority groups. Two key themes dominate the draft. First is the promotion of ethnic Russian culture, which underscores the importance of preserving and developing the cultural heritage of ethnic Russians. The emphasis aligns with the Putin administration's broader narrative of reinforcing national unity through a strong Russian identity. The second one is heightened focus on external threats. The document expresses concern over foreign influences, particularly immigration and international outreach to Russia's ethnic minorities. While the draft is expected to provoke debate and may face delays in approval, its core priorities are unlikely to change. Analysts suggest this reflects a broader ideological shift in Moscow, one that prioritizes the majority population and the national security over multicultural accommodation.
Now let's zone in on the east-plaining portion of our show. From the icy tundra of Siberia to the bustling streets of Moscow, Russia's vast landscape is reflected in the rich diversity of its people. Its 150 million citizens represent more than 190 ethnic groups across the country.
Modern-day Russia, spanning 17 million square kilometers and home to over 146 million people, is a complex ethnic tapestry shaped by its vast geography and historical legacy. Ethnic Russians constitute up to 78% of the population, forming the majority with Slavic heritage and the Russian language as a unifying force. However, Russia is a multi-ethnic state encompassing over 190 distinct groups. The Tatars, the largest minority at roughly 4%, are a Turkic people, primarily resisting in Tatarstan and neighboring regions. Other significant minorities include Ukrainians, Bashkirs, and Chuvash. In the Caucasus, ethnic groups such as Chechens and Dagestanis enrich Russia's diversity, while indigenous Siberian peoples, including Yakuts and Buryats, maintain distinct identities, despite smaller populations. Urban areas increasingly reflect Central Asian influences, with migrant communities like Uzbeks and Tajiks adding to the cultural landscape. While this diversity underscores Russia's historical role as a crossroads of civilizations, it also presents challenges in cultural integration and regional governance. Nevertheless, Russia's ethnic mosaic remains a defining feature of its national identity.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Moscow's newly unveiled nationality policy strategy to 2036 pulls no punches. For the first time in decades, the Russian state is openly placing ethnic Russians, not just Russian citizens, at the center of its national project. Ethnic Russians are now officially declared the state-forming nation. Everyone else? Well, you're welcome to stay, as long as you remember who's really in charge. The Kremlin has always walked a delicate tightrope. Since Soviet times, Moscow balanced the interest of its multi-ethnic empire by at least pretending that non-Russians mattered. The Tatars, Chechens, Buryats, and dozens of other nations had a place at the table, even if that place was often near the kitchen door. But the new policy breaks from that tradition. It's a sharp turn toward a hyper-centralized ethnic Russian identity that doesn't just sideline the country's minorities. It paints them as potential threats. And here's the irony. By trying to forge unity, the Kremlin may be planting the seeds of fragmentation. The man steering the ship is Igor Barinov, head of Russia's Federal Agency for Nationality Affairs. And his message is quite clear. Non-Russian groups, whether by their own will or through supposed Western influence, are seen as potential dangers to national stability. The solution? Integrate them into the Russian nation. On the surface, Moscow claims this is about strengthening civic identity, about making sure that by 2036, at least 95% of people in Russia identify as Russian first, everything else second. But the subtext is deafening. You can be Buryat, Tatar, Chechen, but only after you're Russian. And you will speak Russian, think Russian, and act Russian. The policy's architects have even revived an old Putin dream, making ethnic Russians constitutionally the state-forming nation, a notion rejected in the 2020 constitutional amendments, but now smuggled in through this new framework. For a multi-ethnic federation, this is dangerous ground. Non-Russians make up more than 25% of Russia's population. Some of them remember that the Soviet Union fell apart when national republics stopped believing in the shared story. Some of them remember that the Soviet leadership, in its final days, also tried to centralize power around Russian identity, and it backfired spectacularly. National identities don't disappear when you suppress them. They harden. They go underground. And when the center weakens, as it inevitably will, the provinces that have been forcibly folded into someone else's identity will not rally to save the empire. They will leave. The Soviet Union failed to see it coming. Now, will Putin's Russia make the same mistake? And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Paul Goebel, Distinguished Senior Fellow at Jamestown Foundation. Paul, so glad to have you here with us on Eastern Express. Let me get straight into it here. Now, so to start, you've written a great policy analysis here. Now, what, in your view, is the core motivation, you would say, behind Moscow's decision to dramatically elevate the status of ethnic Russians in this new nationality policy draft? I mean, would you say it's purely domestic? Is it driven by international pressures as well? And I mean, we're talking about what happens to the ethnic minorities here and how they identify themselves.
It's a major shift, and it's a shift that reflects both domestic Russian concerns and international trends. One scholar in Moscow has suggested that if the 20th century was the century of ethnic minorities, the 21st century is going to be the century of ethnic majorities, that in many countries around the world, we see governments focusing on the majority nationality. That's true in Russia, it's true in the United States, and it's true in a variety of other places. Some of us think this is a very dangerous development because if you focus away from the minorities, you will tend to encourage the majority to be repressive of minorities, and that will lead to the appearance of even stronger national movements that will seek independence. Clearly, Mr. Putin thinks that appealing to the ethnic Russian majority, which is not the 80% he likes to claim, but probably more like 65 to 70%, is a winning strategy because they are the majority and they are able, at least so far, to control the non-Russians. But the consequence of focusing on the Russians to the exclusion largely of the non-Russians guarantees that ethnic hostility between the two will grow and that non-Russians will be more, not less, interested in secession and independence.
Well, right. I mean, in the Soviet era, I mean, nationality management tried to actually balance multiple ethnicity. I mean, this comes from someone who's born in the Soviet Union, in the USSR. Now, what are the risks for Moscow in abandoning that balancing act now? I mean, if you could just go into a little bit more detail.
Fine. The first risk is that the non-Russians will feel neglected And the Russians, ethnic Russians, will feel encouraged to ignore the non-Russians or repress them further. That's a very dangerous situation. We've already seen the emergence of the Russian community, various nationalist groups in the ethnic Russian group, and their attitudes and actions toward the non-Russians have made the situation a great deal worse. This is especially true because the ethnic Russian percentage of the population is dropping. Birth rates among Russians are significantly lower than among non-Russians. And so by mid-century, or perhaps even sooner, the population of the territory that is now the Russian Federation will not be 65% ethnic Russian, but approaching perhaps 55 or even 53% ethnic Russian. And that brings us back to where we were in 1991, where roughly half of the population was ethnic Russian and another half was non-Russian, which was one of the major drivers of the coming apart of the USSR in December 1991. So that's the overwhelming problem that you're going to see. We're already seeing it. Non-Russians feel that they are empowered by the state to lash out at non-Russians, to ignore non-Russian interests. And we're seeing a response of non-Russians of anger, of a sense that we want to control our own destiny. And an increasing number of people among the non-Russians are saying, we want our own state, we want independence. That is a very explosive situation when you have in the Kremlin someone who is prepared to use a great deal of force. My fear is that what Putin has put in place with the new policy, where focus on the ethnic Russian majority vastly overwhelms that on anyone else, is going to be an explosive one where you will have ethnic clashes, one where you will have Moscow forced as a result of its own policies to become ever more repressive, not less so, and to engage in more foreign wars, not fewer. So this is a concern not only to the peoples of the Russian Federation, but it's a concern of the neighbors. One way you deal with ethnic challenges at home is to engage in, quote, good little wars abroad. Mr. Putin thought he had that strategy in Georgia in 2008. He's thought he had that strategy in Ukraine since 2014. Neither of those worked as fully as he hoped. And so there is a great danger that what he has announced about domestic nationality policy and his tilt to the ethnic Russians away from the non-Russians will have very serious consequences for other neighbors of the Russian Federation.
Let me ask you this, could you tell us possibly which regions or republics do you see the most vulnerable for this separatism if this strategy does actually move forward?
Well, I think it's very clear we're already moving in the direction that the draft policy document says. This simply codifies things, makes it more formal, and there were hearings at the Duma yesterday in which the head of the Federal Agency for Nationality Affairs said, we're going to focus 80% of our effort on the ethnic Russians, not on the non-Russians. Now, if you accept that the ethnic Russians form 80% of the population, that sounds superficially reasonable, but in fact, the Federal Agency for Nationality Affairs is the only agency that the non-Russians have to be represented. So if you make their policy center focused on the ethnic Russians, they're really driven out. With respect to what areas are going to be the most radical, right now we're seeing movements across the North Caucasus, which is the traditional center of ethnic unrest in Russia. We're seeing mobilization in Bashkortostan. We're seeing them also in the Russian Far East, in Sakha, Yakutia, and in the Altai Republic. And I believe what we will also see is that the ethnic Russian community will fragment. This, in many ways, what Putin has announced is a Muscovite strategy. And I would suggest that we're likely to see important regional movements who have many of the same problems the non-Russians do emerge, first and foremost, east of the Urals in what has historically been Russian Siberia.
Well, that was actually my next question to you with exactly what you just said. But how would you say that this new strategy actually ties into the broader pattern of Russia's neo-imperialistic ambitions?
Well, it's not going to work. I mean, that's the first thing. It's going to make it more difficult.
But he thinks it will.
It's going to drive.
But Putin obviously thinks it will work.
Well, Putin thought he could take Kiev in 3 days, and that didn't happen. Putin is not always right. Like Big Brother, he isn't always right, and he's not right on this. This is a very dangerous, counterproductive strategy, which will force him to use more force at home, to engage in more aggression abroad, and the consequence of that will be unsustainable as far as Russia is concerned. Their military industry is already in trouble. Shipbuilding has more or less collapsed. We're seeing a Ukrainian state that most people thought Moscow would walk over, if not in 3 days, perhaps in 3 months. Well, it's now been more than 3 years, and the Ukrainians are still fighting. I think that what we're seeing is Mr. Putin is overextending himself. This is the kind of bombastic enthusiasm for the majority nationality that sounds good on paper, but once you start implementing it, other people get angry. The non-Russian or the ethnic Russians get out of control, as has happened with the Russian community and other groups, and you will see violence at home, the demand for more repression, and the use of more aggression abroad to try to cover it and justify it in the eyes of the population. Those are very dangerous things. I understand what Mr. Putin wants. He wants a Russian national state. The problem is a third of the population of his country isn't ethnic Russian, and they're not going to sit still for being repressed like this. I think that Mr. Putin had made some progress in the first decade of his rule in quieting the non-Russians by the use of force in Chechnya. But on the other hand, he had to make enormous concessions and passed a great deal of money to non-Russian leaders to keep things quiet. What this policy shift suggests is that he's going to make fewer concessions to the non-Russians, give more to the ethnic Russians, and that sets the stage for an explosive development, if not in the next month, certainly in the next year or two.
Paul, and just very briefly, what role does the Russian Orthodox Church play in all of this? I mean, we know that Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, just in general, gives the Russian Orthodox Church quite a big role as well.
Well, the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, to give it its full name, is slavishly supportive of the Kremlin. There are Russian Orthodox hierarchs who don't think that this attack on non-Russians is the smartest thing they can do, because they know that if the Russian Orthodox Church, and indeed Russia, is going to survive, they're going to have to make friends with some non-Russians rather than alienate all of them. But the Russian Orthodox Church leadership, and especially Kirill, who spent much of his life as a KGB officer, and many people still see him as an FSB officer, is someone who is enthusiastic about the use of force, who is quite prepared to identify with things Russian, with the Russian language, Russian culture, and so on, and support a Kremlin that is moving in a direction that may sound good, make Kirill and Putin feel good, but that is leading to disaster for their country and for themselves.
Thank you so much, Paul Gobel, for all your insight here today on such an important topic that may reshape the future of Russia and identity.
Thank you.
And we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. NATO says Russia has the resources to continue its war in Ukraine through at least 2027. But the alliance warns that Moscow's defense industry is already stretched to its limits.
Russia is capable of maintaining its current level of military operations in Ukraine for at least 2 more years, at least according to a senior NATO official cited by the BBC's Russian service. Despite growing economic strain, the Kremlin reportedly retains enough financial and material resources to continue the war through 2027. The assessment, shared during NATO's summit in The Hague, highlights that Russia's military-industrial complex is already operating at full capacity, making further expansion unlikely. Economic indicators suggest mounting pressure on Russia's finances. Revised budget figures show a sharp drop in projected oil and gas revenues and a ballooning deficit. This government has increasingly relied on its national wealth fund, which has shrunk significantly and could be depleted by 2026 if commodity prices remain low.
Now, staying with the Russian economy, a growing number of Russian companies report worsening conditions, with pessimism reaching its highest level since the Ukraine invasion. According to a new survey, many firms remain cautiously optimistic about the future.
1 in 3 Russian companies say their business environment has deteriorated over the past 6 months, according to a survey by consulting firm Yakov & Partners. The 34% reporting a downturn marks the highest level of pessimism since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The report, prepared for the recent St. Petersburg International Economic Forum and obtained by Forbes Russia, highlights that sectors such as mining, heavy industry, chemicals, oil and gas, energy and transportation are experiencing the steepest declines. Investment activity is also slowing, with a quarter of companies pausing or delaying projects and 13% suspending non-essential initiatives. Despite these challenges, 66% of businesses said their conditions had remained stable or improved, though that is down from 84% in 2024.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching, and until next time.